HTTP defines a number of status codes that are used to describe server responses to client requests. You should be familiar with the most common status codes and understand when it's appropriate to use them as part of your web API design. There are 5 classes of status codes. The first digit of each status code defines the class of response to which it belongs. The 5 classes of HTTP status codes are shown here. Class 100 codes are informational and in practice are rarely used. Class 200 codes indicate a request was successful, with some variation in the details. Class 300 codes are used for redirection to indicate that a resource may be found elsewhere. Class 400 codes are used to describe various client errors, including authentication and authorization failures. And Class 500 codes are used to indicate server errors. The HTTP specification states that clients must at least understand these 5 classes of status codes, even if the specific flavor of code is not understood. Any unrecognized code should be treated like its base 00 code prefixed with that class's first digit. Different operations typically have different appropriate status code responses. The key scenarios you will typically encounter are getting a resource, creating a resource, modifying a resource, deleting a resource. Together, these first 4 represent typical CRUD, or create, read, update, delete operations. Additionally, you'll need to consider security and permissions, as well as the possibility of unhandled exceptions. When fetching a resource, the success response is simply 200 OK. If the resource in question has moved, a 301 or 302 code may be returned. Note that unlike most browsers, API clients typically are not configured to automatically follow redirects. If caching is being used, a response of 304 not modified may be returned to indicate to the client that their existing copy of the resource is still current. If the client requests a resource that does not exist, a 404 not found is typically returned. And if a particular client has sent too many requests within a certain time window, the server may return a 429 code to indicate this. Authentication and authorization failures will have their own responses, which we'll cover on their own. When creating a resource, typically with a post, the following status codes typically apply. 200 OK can be used when posting to get an access token, since no resource is modified or created. You can also use a 200 OK if you intend to return the created resource in the body of the response. 201 created is the standard success response when creating a new resource and simply providing a link to its URI. According to the standard, the URI of the created resource should be returned in a location header. 202 accepted is used for async processing. Responses should include a location header with a URI for an endpoint to poll. 204 no content may be appropriate if the post method does not result in a location that is identifiable by URI, though this is rare in practice. 303 see other can be used to point to the newly created resource, functionally similar to a 201 created, but designed to aid in caching. A 400 bad request is commonly returned in response to malformatted requests, and 429 again can be used to enforce request limits. If you're using a put or patch, then a 200 OK is fine with no body or with the updated body. If you don't intend to return the resource in the body, then a 204 is more specific. Use a 201 if the put created a new resource, which will typically have the URI to which the put request was made. 202 accepted can be used for longer running processes and can provide a resource that clients can use to check the status. Use 204 if it was successful, but you're not returning anything. A URI can be in the location header field. You should specify a 400 bad request for any syntax or validation errors with the operation. A 404 not found if the URI in question does not correspond to a resource the server knows about. A 409 conflict can be used to ensure that the client isn't modifying a resource that has changed since the client last retrieved it. The payload should provide information to help the client recognize and resolve the conflict. And once more, you can use 429 for request limiting. When deleting a resource, you can return a 200 OK, a 202 accepted if you're going to perform the operation asynchronously, a 204 no content if the operation was successful and you have nothing to return. This is the most common case. A 404 not found if the resource does not exist or was already deleted. And of course a 429 to enforce request limiting. When dealing with security and permissions, the most common response types are a 401 if the client is not authenticated. If it provides authentication, the request may succeed. It should really be called 401 unauthenticated, since that is what this status code actually indicates. A 403 forbidden. This means that the client typically is authenticated, so the server knows who they are, but the client does not have permission to access the resource in question. And a 404 not found, which can be used if the backend either doesn't know about the resource or does not want to reveal that the resource exists to the client for security reasons. For example, if you try to reach a private GitHub repository while you are not logged in, or if you lack permission to view it, in either case, you will be told the repository is not found. If there is an unhandled server exception, the only thing you can return is a 500 server error, possibly with some reference information that will aid in diagnosing the problem from the server's log files. Be sure to return the proper class of status code when you have unrecoverable errors on the server. Do not return error responses in the body of responses that otherwise have a 200 OK or similar success status code. APIs that do this are notoriously more difficult to program against because every so-called success response must be inspected to determine whether or not it was, in fact, successful. Now let's look at some examples of the proper use of HTTP status codes. We're going to return to where we left off with the demo on HTTP verbs, but this time we're going to focus on the status codes that are being returned. For example, when we posted a new author, we saw that we got a 201 created. And if you mouse over the 201 created in Postman, it will tell you what this response means. Any type of 2XX code, of course, is going to represent success. So when we do a GET request and it's successful, we get a 200 OK. And the same is true when we do a delete, we get a 204 no content. All of these are telling us that the request was successful. But what happens if the request isn't successful? Let's look at an example where we try to create an author, but we're not going to provide it with a name. And it might be that the name is actually required. So here in the body of the request, we'll try and create one that doesn't have a name and send that. And you'll notice that we get a 400 bad request response. In this case, it's telling us that the request cannot be fulfilled due to bad syntax. The client has made a mistake that is making it so the server can't process their request. Now, I'm using some built-in ASP.NET Core features to do model validation, and one of the nice things about that is it will format those errors in a way that is nice to send back to the client. And so you can see in the response that I have the information that the client would need, in this case stating that the name field is required. You can do a lot of things with data annotations, as we'll see later in this course, to make it so that this model validation and the responses that you send back are very informative to the client, and you absolutely should do that. Now, I've modified this endpoint so that any submission will create an exception. So now when I send a new response here, a new post, if I provide it with the proper values, what we're going to see is a 500 internal server error. This is the message that you want to return if there is a problem where an exception goes unhandled on the server. Do not use a try-catch to capture this problem and then only show back a 200 response to the user. You definitely don't want to have your error messages come back in the disguise of being a success status code. That will cause countless problems for your clients. So 500 internal server error is the appropriate response when there is an exception on the server that you can't handle. You don't necessarily have to show the exception results here. In this case, they are being displayed because I'm running it in developer mode. But in your production APIs, this 500 internal server error should not display any significant information to the user. Instead, it should maybe just provide them with some correlation ID or error code that they could then use to look up information later about the source of the problem, or to help the developers diagnose the issue. But while you're developing locally, it can certainly be helpful to allow the developer exception information to be rendered for you. All right, so that is just a few of the quick, most common response codes and how you would use them inside of your web APIs.